Bum 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum. One of my first Thanksgivings that I can remember was in 1992. I was in kindergarten at the time. My parents had invited an old friend of my dad's from graduate school, and he and his family had stayed overnight at our home. We lived in a suburb of Pittsburgh. I had my first video game system. It was a Sega Genesis, and I used to love to play this space shooting game called Truxton. And I never got past stage two of the game. Stage two of Truxton had a boss level that was really hard. You can actually find people playing it on YouTube these days. I never dreamed that the day would come where you could just search on a device you can hold on your hands, right? Because you got to remember what a Sega Genesis looked like back then, right? It was a big box that required a television set that was the size of a what is a washing machine nowadays, right? And I would have never, if you had told me that 30 years from now, there's a device you can hold on your hand the size of like a remote control, and you can watch somebody play or even play Truxton on that device. I would have thought that was science fiction, right? Can you believe that in 1992 if somebody told you that, right? But in 1992, my dad's friend came over, and he and I played Truxton all night, and he beat level two, and I was very impressed by that. And he went on to beat the rest of the game, and I had a good time with him. And I stayed up pretty late, and I was impressed by the idea of how late one could stay up. Right? Got to remember, as a 5-year-old kid, the concept that there are so many hours in the middle of the night was kind of novel to me as well. Right? And I think I stayed up until at least midnight, 1 o'clock, and it was one of the first times we had anybody over at the house as well, so that was fun too. That was Thanksgiving of 1992, and unfortunately, it turned out to be the very last Thanksgiving before the first time the Twin Towers were attacked, and it all went to shit from there. Unfortunately, right? It's kind of sad how fast time goes, and how things unfold over time. Another one of my memorable Thanksgivings was in 2000. By this time, I was going to college part time. I was 13 years old. I had a professor that year that I came to love, but at the time that I was taking his class, I was fearful of. He was very serious in what he was working with, and it has turned out well in his career, I suppose. So I still stay in contact with him from time to time. Also, that year, my mom took me to a party. It was held at a restaurant, and I got to see a number of other college students, and they all thought I was a genius. And now looking back at it, I could have made some connections there, but at the time, I really didn't like the VIP kind of attention that I got. Um, and the next Thanksgiving that sticks out was in 2008. I had just started collecting coins that year. I was working on my PhD. I had some money saved up, and I started investing in precious metals. And just as I start that, the GFC had hit, and silver prices took a big beating. I have a funny story about when I first learned about GFC. What had happened was I had a favorite coin dealer that I was going to regularly. And one day, I think it was a Wednesday, I went there and I learned that silver prices had taken a huge beating. It was now only like $9 an ounce. It had been $15 not that long ago. And even the coin dealer didn't really appreciate what was going on, except for the fact that silver had dipped and he was also buying a lot. And I bought some Canadian silver dollars because the premiums on those were the lowest at the time. And I went back to the campus. I was working on my PhD, and I had a PhD advisor, Her husband was also a PhD advisor at a neighboring school. They both worked with computer science. I used to refer to them as and I even told them then they liked a little bit of a nickname. I called them the Currys of computer science. They were like Mary and Pierre Curie, right? I would say they were more professional partners rather than relationship material, right? They didn't have any children. It doesn't sound like they had much of a sexual relationship. I won't comment on that, but it sounds like it was more of a professional partnership than anything else, right? Just my own observation of it. I think they still don't have children to this day, and we're talking 15 years later. And so I called them the Currys of computer science. I came back to them and bragged about how I had bought all this cheap silver. And my PhD advisor was so upset at me. She says, "Do you understand what's going on?" I said, "No, what happened?" She says, "A lot of people are losing their retirements, and I think it's best not to brag about all this cheap investment you're making. Enjoy it for yourself, but it's best not to brag about it." Right, because especially to the older generation, right, they're really hurting, and you don't need them to hear that you're taking advantage of the situation. I didn't really appreciate it at the time. It was only years later did I digest what she was telling me, and so now when I see the markets free falling like that, I try to just take advantage of it and just try to keep my mouth shut and enjoy and talk about other things when I'm in the company of others. But that whole winter, Thanksgiving, Christmas season of 2008, 2009 was marked by me looking for cheap silver. I didn't have enough money to buy gold and some of the other metals just yet. It was mostly just silver. At the time, there wasn't much uh, publicity about the other metals like strategic metals just yet, right? You might have been able to buy platinum or palladium online, but probably not very easily could you buy a bismuth or indium and I didn't even understand about them at the time, right? I wish I did, right? Bismuth really took a beating, although not as much as it did these last couple of years. In 2019, I had a girlfriend at the time, and she was a lot younger than me, and her grandparents wanted us to get married. She was in her early 20s, I want to say. I was 32 years old, and I was scared to death. You got to remember, at the time, I was in the midst of a career pivot. I had just started my teaching career, and I had worked at some technology startups before that. Didn't really turn out, so I started teaching. It's in the midst of my career pivot. I was also working on a number of publications, and I thought my days of writing the number one AI for I had written the number one AI for the game of for a number of computer games at that point, not backgammon just yet, but a number of other games. And I thought my days of doing that were over, and I was scared to death. I used to love to travel to the Computer Olympiad to compete as well, and I thought those days were over too. And I was scared to death. And I remember asking God that if this is not meant to be, to do something to cause us to break up, right? I will accept it. Whatever event you do to cause us to break up, even if I have to be embarrassed about it, even if it has to hurt, it's better than going down the wrong path. That's what I asked God. This was Thanksgiving of 2019. I probably even said it in a couple of videos back then. Go back and watch. I don't know if I elaborated on this concept that if there's something not right about the relationship, do something, anything at all, to interrupt it. Right. Well, this was Thanksgiving of 2019, right? Only a few months later, God did something very drastic to interrupt the relationship and a bunch of other relationships and a bunch of other people's careers. Most of them for the better, I would say, right? All right. In 2020 Thanksgiving, I moved out to the Rocky Mountains and I lived there for 3 months, and had a good time enjoying this current chapter in my life, I would say. And my last memorable Thanksgiving was in 2022. I had just started my art career making bismuth, and this is one of my latest pieces. I'm really proud of the geodes as of late. Right, they're not easy to do in terms of getting the timing right, but once you get the hang of it, it's uh, every time you do it, it comes out differently, which is what makes it really addictive, right? Because every time you do it, it comes out differently. If you're on a losing streak and every one of them turns out wrong, and you got to remelt them, and you feel like you got to get something after all this time, right? You're chasing your losses, right? And when it's going really well, you're like, oh, I can win more, right? And so it's kind of like a gambling addiction almost, right? I used to have a friend who had a gambling addiction. He was playing online poker, and I remember going to his apartment and seeing him on a bender with his poker. And when I'm in the midst of doing my bismuth art, it has the same vibe to it almost, right? So I got to be careful about that. I've had times where I've gotten very ill from sleep deprivation, from abusing various other things to keep awake to do the bismuth art. Right, I've had times where I didn't eat right. I abused caffeine. I abused Sudafed and a bunch of other stuff to stay up to do bismuth. I got to be careful. It can be very addictive at times. What I try to do is have phases where I dedicate myself to the bismuth, especially if there's a break at my job, right? Thanksgiving break, Christmas break. Oh, that's a perfect time to do that. And then take a break from the bismuth art to go back to my job at the community college. I kind of do it in waves like that because once I start, I can't stop, right? So the only way I can stop is to completely stop, right? So it's kind of like an intermittent fasting pattern, right? You eat once a day, but you don't try to control the amount that you're eating during that one meal, right? That's kind of how I handle my art projects as well, too, right? All right, happy Thanksgiving. This is the Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum.